The Soviet-Afghan War, a history of conflict and consequence. Graveyard of empires. It's time we stop stalling and marks this topic off the list. And if you're hoping for something else, well, Soviet. Oh God, what have I done? Hello and welcome. Brought to you by the Great Courses Plus, more on that later, and featuring the Soviet-Afghan War. A war where the battles were won, but the war was lost. How does that happen? Let's find out. We must understand what Afghanistan is. It's a landlocked country that sits in a harsh, almost inhospitable area between the traditional crossroads of great powers. Forces from India, Far East, Middle East, and the West have all attempted to pass and fallen before Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires. Initially inhabited by many mixed tribal groups, its people survived in the many valleys of the region completely isolated from the outside world. Politics and diplomacy of it were simply irrelevant to them. In the 19th century, the region was of interest to the large Russian and larger British empires who had swooped across Asia, taking as much land as they could. Constantly cautious of one another, Afghanistan's borders were rather incidentally carved as a buffer between the two empires, leading to many arbitrary mixing and splitting of ethnic groups. The British would take many tours into Afghanistan to seize its pivotal central position on the map. However, by 1919, after only managing to slowly chip away at its frontier, Afghanistan would be affirmed as an independent emirate. Afghanistan's modernization and Cold War conflict. By 1919, Afghanistan was affirmed as an independent emirate, and later became a kingdom under King Mohammad Zahir Shah. The country was rapidly pushed into modernization during the 1960s. Urban areas celebrated the establishment of elections, political rights, and women's education. At the same time, the Cold War had entered into full swing. Afghanistan once again became a pawn for two rivaling powers, the US and the USSR, both seeking to gain favor in the country. However, by 1973, things would change. Mohammad Daoud Khan, the king's cousin, staged a bloodless coup against him, declaring himself both president and prime minister of the new Afghan Republic. He pushed for progressive policies, but quickly found himself facing resistance from other ethnic groups who did not appreciate his Pashtun nationalism. The Soviet invasion and the Mujahideen resistance. On Christmas Eve 1979, a combined air and land invasion of Afghanistan commenced, with the Red Army quickly seizing many urban areas, roads, and communication lines. Amin was captured and executed, and replaced by the more moderate Babrak Karmal. Disputes erupted internationally on whether this was an intervention or an invasion. West and many Muslim countries decided on the latter. Tribal warlords were repulsed to the mountains by the invasion, but this only led to a new stage in their struggle. Foreign atheist Orthodox invader gave credence to this being a jihad or holy war, and the warlords soon united as the Mujahideen, committed to combating the Soviets. The U.S. began funneling equipment through Pakistan to the Mujahideen. The U.S. wanted to contain communism, while the Mujahideen wanted Afghanistan independent and Islamic. End of Soviet-Afghan War and ongoing consequences. In 1989, after years of brutal conflict, the last of the Soviet Red Army left Afghanistan, marking the end of the Soviet-Afghan War. But the war was far from over. The Mujahideen continued to resist the Afghan government even after the Soviet withdrawal. However, this led to a new phase of civil war as warlords fought for control of the country, culminating in the rise of the Taliban. Rise of the Taliban and U.S. involvement. In 1994, the Taliban emerged, led by Mullah Omar. The Pakistani government shifted its support from the Mujahideen to the Taliban, and by 1996, they seized control of Kabul. The Taliban brutally executed former President Najibullah, declared Afghanistan an Islamic emirate, and imposed harsh Islamic law across the country. Sood, who had been a key figure in the resistance against the Soviets, continued to fight from the north, holding out against the Taliban's rise. However, his resistance was crushed in September 2001 when he was assassinated by Taliban operatives posing as journalists. 2 days later, the terrorist group Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden, launched the September 11th attacks in the United States, Taliban, who had given bin Laden shelter, refused to surrender him. This refusal led the U.S. to declare a war on terror, which included military action against the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. The aftermath and global repercussions. The U.S. war on terror, launched in response to the 9/11 attacks, saw a swift military invasion that led to the fall of the Taliban regime. However, the longer-term consequences of the Soviet-Afghan War were far-reaching. Mujahideen had splintered into various groups, and the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and other terrorist organizations continued to cause instability in the region. Millions of Afghans died during the conflict, and even more became refugees. War that began with the Soviet invasion continued to reverberate through decades of global instability, spawning terrorist organizations, fueling radicalism, and creating a complex geopolitical web. The Soviet-Afghan War, often overlooked, has had lasting impacts on world history. It is a stark reminder of how conflicts can shape not only the future of a country, but also the entire global order. Many Islamic terrorist organizations trace their roots back to the resistance movements during the Soviet-Afghan War. The ongoing struggle and forgotten history. As history moves on, many people have forgotten or neglected the full impact of the Soviet-Afghan War. However, the consequences of that war are still felt today, as we continue to see the legacy of those conflicts in modern geopolitical struggles. The fact that so many have forgotten the intricacies of the Soviet-Afghan War, yet live under its consequences, is disappointing. Motivations behind the rise of many Islamic extremist groups and the instability in Afghanistan can all be traced back to this war. But that doesn't stop us from continuing to uncover and explore the many hidden motives and repercussions of this devastating conflict. Fortunately, I don't have a funny joke to end on, but instead I'll say, in Soviet rule,